Hello, everyone. I've been here before many times, and I'd like to thank Werner and the OSCE, and of course Begum today. Sorry for the pronunciation. It's great to be in Vienna. It's a wonderful city, and it's nice to see people interested in critical sort of alternative discussions. Okay, right. I don't want to put you off, but that's the idea. Everything's going down, and we're trying to pull it up if we can. So we start with I hope you don't find it too boring, but there's a graph that takes 2015 as a basis and looks at how GDP moved over a long period of time, 2008 to 2022, which is a 15-year period, which includes major events, the global financial crisis, followed then at some point by the pandemic, and then on by the war in Ukraine. And you can see that just as the there's an upward trend, not fast, which then is followed by a plunge in 2020, and then starts going up again a few years later. The US is above the EU, and the EU is above the Eurozone. So this is a very kind of the picture of the past 15 years. Towards the end of that graph, you can see the little lines kind of hesitating a little. And in fact, what you have is at the end of 2022, you have a drop. You have a fall of minus 0.1. It's not much, but if you look down the column on your left-hand side, you can see that big economies like Germany or Hungary or Poland have much higher rates of decline. So this is a worrying picture. It is, and on the right-hand side, you have the main elements, components of GDP, their movement, and you can see that what Keynesians would call the effective demand, which is consumer consumption and household consumption and investment going down, investment in fact quite significantly, and imports of course also go down, and this is only partly made up by the government consumption increasing and exports increasing. So this is what I call flirting with stagnation. This is not a good picture. It is a worrying one, which shows that in the long run, if we go back to the previous one, what have I done now? I wanted to go back to the previous graph. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, if we go back there, we can see that, you know, over a 15-year period, there are all these ups and downs, well, mainly downs, but towards the end, we're back to this kind of uncertain, hesitant situation in terms of changes. Okay. Okay, so that's GDP. What about employment? Well, there is always a lag between what happens to GDP and what happens to employment. So again, taking 2015 as the basis, what you have is the same kind of movement, more or less, with a lag. That is a drop, slow rise, a plunge, and then rising again towards as we come to the end of last year. At the end of last year, there were 215 almost million workers, of whom 77%, about 2/3 were in the Eurozone. So you can see the importance of the Eurozone there in terms of numbers of people, of workers. Unemployment, the other form of, the other way of looking at employment, unemployment reached a peak in the after the global financial crisis started, and then started falling. It is again, you can see that it goes up quite significantly due to the pandemic, comes down again. It's 6% in the EU and 6.6, about 7% in the Eurozone. That is, these figures refer to February this year. But again, what we said for GDP is true also of unemployment, which is the great divergences. Here we have a divergence across age groups, 6% on average in general, that's unemployment, but 14.5% for the under 25s. It is the young people who bear the brunt of unemployment on average. If you look down the list, then there are 11 member states which have both average unemployment and in general and in relation to the under 25s, much higher than the average for the EU. In fact, Spain and Greece have almost double figures to the average. 6% is the average. Spain has 12.8, almost 13%. Greece 11.4. That's on average. And when it comes to the young people, 29% of the young people under 25 in Spain are unemployed. Now, this is an army of unemployed people. And because mobility is quite high in the EU, that's why, although you have a stock, which is a number of unemployed people, you can also see the flow behind it. These people, these young people, will migrate at some point and serve the needs of other economies. So, inflation, one more macro aspect of the economy. Now, I was going to say that when Magnus mentioned polycrisis, I remember actually writing that bit and going through the literature. And of course, the mainstream guys, economists, consider inflation as part of the crisis, but inflation is the result of the crisis. When you talk about polycrisis, you don't include inflation, you include everything else that has caused inflation to happen. So here we have inflation. This is a 10-year period. It's every March in these years. And you can see that inflation has been very low, almost at some points it was even negative. But it's picking up sometime in 2021. And that's the so-called return of inflation and the inflation scare. You know, I mean, all the mainstream guys, the economists were really shocked. And but what was it due to? I mean, right now that these figures go up to March 2020, this year, it's 6.9% right now, or in March it was. And you can also see the components of what makes up this rate of inflation. And the thin red line is energy. If we go to the table, we have a clearer picture of that. You can see there that energy, if you look across the table, go down to energy, and you can see that in March 2022, the energy price inflation was 44.3%, which is incredible. Okay, so that was due to the disruptions, supply disruptions, because of the lifting of the restrictions during the pandemic. As the restrictions were lifted, there was a push across a number of things, with energy sort of having the greater push. Commodities also were pushed up in terms of prices. Okay, so you have, on the one hand, supply was limited and therefore it had to respond. You had pent-up demand, and of course you have speculation. Under these conditions, this is a party to speculators. So, but of course that is transitory. And this is what, not just the heterodox people, but I mean, Krugman said that. He said, guys, this is transitory. It's going to stop. You know, at some point, there won't be, things will be normalized in terms of process of production. And indeed, if you go down that line or across that line on energy, you can see that last March, it was negative. And in fact, it is that it is the drop in energy prices which accounts for the greatest part of the reduction of the inflation rate. Although this is pretty clear, you don't need to be an economist to see that. All you have to do is to look at the statistics. This was, you know, what I don't know, the central banks starting with the Federal Reserve, they got really crazy last year and starting in late 2021 and no, it was in 2022. March, the Federal Reserve, July, the ECB, they start raising interest rates like crazy. The frenzy. It was the Financial Times called it frenzy. So, inflation dynamics and greedflation. Greedflation is a new term, and it's not mine, but I like it. See, what's happening? We saw that the inflation, it was 7.4 a year ago, and it's gone down to 6.9. It went up during the year, last year, and it's been coming down since last December, mainly because of energy. But in fact, if you look down the last column, March 2023, this year, you can see that if you exclude energy, the inflation rate is 7.9. It's more than the average. Okay, because energy brings it down by minus 0.9. So if you put it back, or if you take it out, sorry, then you have a higher rate of inflation. So the question is, I mean, labor unions have been claiming part of the recovery of the value of the wages and salaries because inflation has reduced the real value of compensation, worker compensation, but it is not really the case that suddenly wages and salaries have risen so much. So what is keeping inflation high? That is a question. And this is where greedflation comes in. Isabella Weber, who's been doing some very interesting work, together with another colleague, is challenging the wage price spiral, which is the kind of mainstream way of looking at this. Wages rise, prices rise. We have to hold down prices so that wages don't rise because wages are the big enemy. But she says, well, it's not wages. It is the prices that are pushing prices up. It is price spiral. In other words, because you have these pricing shocks regarding inputs in the production process, companies find that it is easier to raise prices with little resistance from their customers because the inflation story has been so widely discussed that people expect prices to rise. And therefore, you end up with what is known as greedflation, which is supported by the statistics on profit margins, especially in the US, where they have very good statistics. This is shown very clearly. In the case of the EU also, if you look at the share of wages and the share of compensation, which is wages plus contributions, that is dropping, that is declining, and the share of profits is increasing. Therefore, the theory is Weber's theory is supported by the EU statistics as well. And of course, you have Fabio Panetta, a member of the executive board of ECB, who has very clearly said, that was at the end of March this year, that we're paying so much attention to wages and to the wage price spiral, but in fact, it is profits that we should be looking at. So, policies, monetary policy. The ECB, that is the one policy that has a European sort of basis, and it's the ECB response, which has embarked on a quantitative tightening exercise. It has discontinued its QE programs. It has been raising its interest rates. Starting in July, there have been 6 interest rate increases. The latest one was last March, about a month ago, so that the main refinancing operations interest rate, which is what banks pay when they borrow for a week, and which accounts for the bulk of liquidity in the EU, that has risen from 0% in July last year to 3.5%. It is not, I mean, 0% is not, it's an anomaly. Nobody wants 0% interest rates. That is another anomaly. But the fast and great increase in interest rates is dangerous. And you can see what's happening in the US banking sector. When interest rates rise, the value of assets falls. There's an inverse relationship. The banks that have invested into long-term assets may find themselves in a difficult position should a bank run happen. This is what happened in the case of the Silicon Valley Bank. Suddenly, they had invested in long-term assets, and they couldn't liquidate them fast enough, and therefore they don't run them. So there is a serious financial stability risk in this kind of policy. Of course, Lagarde has said that well, whatever happens, we'll just carry on, and quoting this 2% holy figure. But Panetta is, in his nice Italian way, has said, well, that's like driving like crazy with your headlights off. Problem. So this is the main way that the EU has responded to the increase in inflation and the dangers that go with it. In the area of fiscal policy, well, fiscal policy has been a concern for member states. After the next generation EU recovery plan, which was put together to deal with the pandemic, no more coordinated fiscal policy has been put in place. During this time, there is an ongoing review of the Stability and Growth Pact. Now, I don't want to go into details because we don't have the time. I'm already running late. But the main innovation of the Commission's proposal, which was submitted last November, is that it sort of moves away from the annual surveillance of and expectation that the deficit and the debt, public deficit and public debt of member states should be below the institutional limits of 3% for the deficit and 6% for the debt. It has moved away from this annual kind of exercise, and it has shifted it to a medium-term structural plan idea, which says that if we agree, the Commission and the member states agree on a long-term, not medium-term, 4 years. And if you do everything right, then it can be go up to 7 years plan. Then you can, towards the end of that period, you're expected to actually have brought your deficit and debt down to the institutional limits or near enough. Now, right now, Germany is disagreeing, and Germany wants to make absolutely certain that debt and deficit will drop as a percentage of GDP, mainly through the reduction in the deficit and the debt rather than the increase in GDP, because it's a ratio, right? If you increase GDP, the ratio drops. But the main emphasis is on the debt and the deficit. If Germany has its way, it's still being discussed, then we're actually they would be introducing bits of the old Stability Pact, which everyone agrees was ineffective. And if I may be allowed to say the word, we'll have a bastard Stability Pact. The new one will be bits of this and bits of that. It won't work. That's my own personal opinion. I think, quite a number of people are sort of in the critical area share that opinion. But it will sort of soon enough. Okay, that's what I call squaring the fiscal circle. That's the proposal. There was this meeting in March, just very recently. A number of things have to be clarified. Germany is trying to do what it can, but in fact, Blanchard has come out saying this is the worst form of procyclical fiscal policy. And just to have an idea of what we're talking about, right at the bottom of that slide, you have the figures for the deficit. Only 2 member states, that's Denmark and Luxembourg, have a surplus. everyone else, that's 25 member states, have a deficit, and in fact, quite a number of them have a high deficit, starting from 7.8 to 6.5 in France, 7.8 in Malta, 6.5 in France. So if Germany has its way, which is to enforce a limit on an annual basis, in other words, not the 3%, but to have to reduce your ratio of debt to GDP by 1%, that's the German proposal right now, every year, that will mean new austerity measures. And that will hold any progress done in the past few years. And we saw the earlier graphs that, you know, it's an uphill struggle, difficult uphill struggle. And this is the graph showing the debt in the debt to GDP in that is towards the end of last year. That's the end of the third quarter in 2022. Well, the champion is Greece, followed by Italy. Even the EU on average is above 80%, and quite a number of member states are above the 80%. So you can see the difficulty in actually implementing. I mean, it's difficult anyway, but if it's made even more difficult by the German proposal, then we're in for, again, a pretty rough ride. Okay, alternatives. Alternatives. Fiscal policy. Well, monetary policy does not do the work. It cannot do the work. It's a blunt instrument. I mean, the central banks are saying that it will work in the long term. It will take a while, you know, be patient. You will be hurt slowly and steadily. And in fact, they don't even know whether, I mean, the fiscal, the financial instability that took place in the US and in the case of the Credit Suisse showed that they haven't, the central banks are doing things which they're not fully, either they're not fully aware or they do not fully acknowledge the risks that go with it. So if not monetary policy, what then? Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, well, lots of things you can do. You can raise taxes on income and wealth, high net worth individuals, large corporations. You can tax the windfall gains, which have been very significant for energy providers, other manufacturers, the financial sector. And with the proceeds from higher taxation, you can reduce indirect taxation on basic foods, basic goods and services. You can apply price controls. Price controls have a bad name because they failed in the 70s, but they didn't actually fail as such. What happens is when they were taken off, and to the extent that they had been actually implemented, when they were taken off, then inflation rose again. So it is a way of doing it rather than, you know, the actual concept that is problematic. And of course, to the standard recurring theme of our memo is that the EU budget should be increased. I mean, the federal budget in the US is 15 to 20% of GDP, and in the European Union, it's around 1%. We have always been saying 5%. To my mind, this is the minimum you can go up to. Common borrowing, it was tried and tested. It was successful in the context of the Next Generation EU program. So why stop it? I mean, this is a regular financial instrument. It doesn't do any harm, and it provides a lot of leeway. But it's been, I mean, it was a temporary measure. And of course, the review. Climate, I mean, I criticize the German proposal, but basically one has to point out that climate change and social policy, although they are mentioned in the proposals of the Commission, there are no specific indicators that will be mandatory like the ratios of GDP and deficit. You need specific indicators, you need specific financing to go with climate change and social policy when it comes to discussing national medium-term structural plans. The last slide, energy system. Well, it's a public good. It should be treated as such. Investment, Magnus already mentioned that, and the need for public banks, which are very rare nowadays. They were privatized in the 90s, and 2000s, but they can be very, very useful, especially in the present situation. Well, thank you very much. Sorry I didn't do that.